And, we're back to regular class. Let you do whatever it is that you need to do. Okay? All right, so PT6, present knowledge is wholly dependent on past knowledge. Discuss this claim with reference to two areas of knowledge. All right, so keywords that we always look at. The most important thing by far in here is the word wholly. Okay, which means entirely, completely, which is a big deal. Okay, it's the most important because it means that in order for the PT to be correct, present knowledge cannot exist without past knowledge. All right, so conversely, that means that if you can find one instance of present knowledge that was not directly fed by past knowledge, then you have disproven the PT. Okay, so that seems like it shouldn't be a tall task. There are always exceptions. Absolutes are always something to avoid, and this is an absolute. So if you can figure out one instance of present knowledge sort of being, the product of inspiration or the product of personal preference, then you've disproven the PT. Okay? So what does it mean to be dependent? Does it mean that it's inspired or supported by, or does it mean it could not exist without? So just like in the other PTs, you're going to have to define this at the beginning. How are you dealing with this is the question. Okay? Do you consider dependent to mean couldn't exist without, or just supported by? All right, now again, that word wholly seems to really make it seem as if it is entirely connected and could not exist without it. Okay, think about the example of like a parent and a child, right? Your existence is wholly dependent on the existence of your parents. Okay, it is, right? If they didn't exist, you don't exist. Simple as that. Okay, but when you are talking about knowledge and ideas, it's a little bit more complicated than just saying, you were entirely dependent because you are alive. You might take the analogy further and say, well, technically all of you, or definitely the vast majority of you, are considered legal dependents of your parents right now. Okay? So when they file their taxes, they can mark you off as a dependent. I have 2 legal dependents in my house. Now, does that mean that you guys are entirely dependent and could not exist without your parents? No. Right? There are many examples of people your age moving on and living and being successful and having a normal life and without any support at all from their parents. So that takes it in another way. You are sort of legally wholly dependent on your parents, but there are definitely other aspects of you that are not dependent, right? You may not be spiritually dependent on them. You may not be financially dependent on them. You may be supporting your parents, some of you, okay? So when you say wholly, it would mean that in every way. So if the question was just rephrased as children are wholly dependent on their parents, then you could probably say no. Because if there's one instance of a child not being dependent on their parent, then it disproves it. And so, if, for example, you wanted to say that, maybe emotionally or even physically, you are not technically physically dependent on your parents, right? They don't need to pick you up and move you around. Thank God, some people, are physically dependent on their parents, but thank goodness that nobody in this room is right now. But that would be, that there's an example of you not being entirely or wholly dependent on your parents. All right, so it seems like that this wholly and this word dependent are a bit problematic, and we need to define them at the beginning. Also, what do we mean by present knowledge? Is it only verified, justified, and shared knowledge, or can it also apply to unverified or personal knowledge? Because if it's only shared knowledge, then it feels a little bit more like it should be true, right? Because shared knowledge is the knowledge that we all agree on, the knowledge within the areas of knowledge. The easy one that everybody goes to on this is science, because science has a process, the scientific method by which we take existing knowledge, test it against new claims, and then build additional knowledge out of that. So there's a mechanism for the dependency of current knowledge on past knowledge. So science is a place that a lot of people will go to with this and say, yes, knowledge in the sciences is entirely dependent on past knowledge. Okay, so if you define knowledge as being shared knowledge in this aspect, then that would fit the bill. Science would seem to fit the bill for something that is wholly dependent. Yes?
So for science, for dependence, would you mostly classify it the supported by, or could it exist without? Because for some scientific discoveries, there could have been other methods of discovering that scientific.
Yeah. Without a doubt, science is going to have instances where new ideas, inventions, discoveries were not directly influenced by previous discoveries. Okay? So I off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but I know that there are.
Flight patterns of a certain type of bird, and if you're comparing it to a different type of bird, you get better results for example, something like that.
No, that would seem to be something that was dependent, because you've got existing studies on other animals. Okay, it would have to be a study in which
that'd be it's dependent, but it's more support. It's supported, previous knowledge supports it. It's not. It doesn't exist without it.
Right. If you define dependent as being, let's call it a hard definition, that dependent means that it is directly related to it, then you would have to say that a study that borrowed from various other ideas was not directly dependent on it. Okay, so that's one way to get around it in the sciences. Okay, but if you use a more loose definition where you say that no, it's actually where it can be inspired by or informed by, then it's a little bit more difficult in the sciences to get around this idea of dependency. At least because the rules of science are such that you are supposed to look. So if you were to have a study on migration patterns or something like that, in order for other scientists to accept it as science, they would want to see that you compared it and verified it against findings from other scientists. Okay? Science does not exist in a vacuum. It requires other scientists to verify ideas. Okay? So the processes in science seem to support this. Now, that's if you hold to a strict shared knowledge definition here, okay, which definitely leaves out a big part of the equation, which is personal knowledge. So if you've got a scientist who may have taken some information from somewhere else in order to inspire their ideas, but, for example, imposed their own personal preference on that, then that would be personal knowledge infiltrating a new set of knowledge, and thereby sort of no longer being dependent on past knowledge. The problem is that you're not supposed to do that in science, right? You're not supposed to allow personal bias or things like that into the equation. Okay? So if you gave an example of science, which is probably where most people will go with this, and if you're writing on this, I would probably avoid natural sciences because it's what everybody's going to do. Everybody's going to go the path of the scientific method. Okay? So I would probably avoid it if at all possible. Yeah.
We could talk about faith if we're like negating the PT.
Mm-hmm.
Like we can
He's totally right.
we can say that faith-based knowledge doesn't really depend on any experiences at all. I mean, faith can kind of arise spontaneously, or it can.
So the other side of the argument against natural sciences would be either the arts, religious knowledge, or ethics. Okay, these are places where your own personal opinions are really important. Okay, and yes, definitely within faith, within religious knowledge systems, each person in most religions is supposed to come to a personal relationship with God or whoever, whatever the deity or main idea of what is powerful is in that religion. So in that sense, right, you wouldn't really need past knowledge to do that. There's also a question here of, how much is required? Because, in order to come to a decision on your religion, is it required that you know the entire history of the religion? Absolutely not. It seems ridiculous, right? People that go to church or temple, or a mosque, or a Buddhist temple, any religion, they go to continue studying. It's a lifelong process. They're never going to know everything. Even the Pope doesn't know everything. All right? So religious knowledge systems, and particularly art, have a major issue with this. Okay? Because art, as the artist, you are typically taking ideas from various different places and then producing a new piece of art. But does that have to be entirely dependent on what you've learned in the past? Or can you just create things with very little training whatsoever? It seems pretty obvious that you could create things without having studied past masterpieces or other artists. You can come up with your own movement. Jackson Pollock is a great example of this, the splatter and drip artist. There had never been anything prior to that. Well, and then you could come in and say, well, wait a second, he's using paint, he's using canvas, so doesn't that mean that his art is still dependent on past knowledge? It seems like you are, that's a very strict definition. You're basically saying in that sense that, if you do anything at all that anyone previously did, so meaning if you even use an image, if you want to go that far, right, exactly. You are gaining sustenance from the earth. You're eating, and so without that you couldn't have survived. Therefore, your current knowledge, that seems a little bit excessive. Yeah.
I mean, you can contradict that theory though, like the theory that for art that you can come up with a completely new idea, because art, literature is classified within art. So for literature, you can't really come up with something that's fully new, because either way you're going to be using a theme or a topic or a genre that was previously used in your novels. So technically, just from your past experience, reading, writing, doing whatever in life, hearing anything, you can't come up with any new, totally new piece of art, since literature counts as an art. So if you're touching that topic, you can talk about, you can contradict how in art forms, such as math, art pieces, you can talk about how that you can, that not everything depends on previous knowledge. But for literature, it does, because even if you come up with new characters, you can't. There's always going to be something. If there's a love story, you're basing that off of previous novels or previous work. So there's no wholly new piece of literature.
Right, but I think that's why at the beginning you have to define what you consider to be dependent, okay? Is it just that it got some inspiration from, or is it that there is a specific cause and effect line that shows you from original one piece gets you to another piece? Because again, it feels a little bit excessive for you to say, and this is a similar title that has been around, okay? They do this every couple of years. How much do we know now is dependent on what we've experienced in the past. And again, if you want to be really extreme about it, then you say, well, nobody can exist without a society because we grow up in a society, and when you're born, you have to be raised by your parents and have to be fed, and therefore you are dependent on past knowledge because everything that you've done now is dependent on the fact that you were born and raised. It seems excessive. It seems beyond what they're really kind of looking for here. All right. Now, past knowledge, and that gets to this. Does it include all of your experiences, or just the knowledge claims that you have consciously accepted as being true? Again, it feels excessive to say that it's everything, but you need to delineate that at the beginning and state that you are aware that some people could consider this to be everything that you have learned, and show that that's not what you're going to deal with. You're going to deal with more knowledge claims that exist within a specific area that have perhaps a specific causal chain leading up to them. Okay? Yeah.
I think you could also use natural science to argue like the other side that it's not dependent, because in natural science, like, yes, past knowledge is important, but at the end of the day, if you're talking about something like physics or chemistry, it's like what's going to be the deciding factor in whether something's true or not is like what you observe on the real world, and like that's how you come up with a hypothesis, and that's how you test the hypothesis. It's not just like making connections between existing knowledge.
I think it's a very good point. I think, you could go into scientific principles that are, or issues that are current. For example, modern issues such as climate change, to which there are not really any precedent to in the past. The whole debate over whether or not climate change is a product of mankind, or whether or not it's a natural process. What we're seeing in climate change now is not like any other climate change that's happened before, because there have never been as many fossil fuels as there have been before. So it's hard to say, oh, this is entirely dependent on past knowledge, when it requires you, the very nature of the problem requires that you look at current data as opposed to past data. So that is another way to go about it. Go ahead.
I mean, I think, interestingly, if you look at ethics, right, you look at like how people know what right and wrong is. I mean, I think a lot of the time, the way people understand what right and wrong is, in the first place, is through like emotional knee-jerk reactions to situations. Like, I mean, I think like a real life example of that would be after the Parkland shooting. A lot of people say gun ownership was wrong because they had an emotional reaction to the tragedy that had taken place. But that doesn't depend on past knowledge. That depends like on an in the moment reaction. Right, so like I think ethical determinations are often in the moment.
Okay, if you want to go real philosophical on this approach, there is a philosophical concept of knowledge without experience, which is a priori, and then knowledge post-experience, which is a posteriori. And a priori knowledge is knowledge that you have innately. And ethics is a definite place where we find this. And the idea here is that if you see somebody hurting someone, then you have a feeling that that's wrong, even if maybe you've never seen someone hurt in that way before. Okay? Or if you want to take it to a further extreme, if you see something that's dead, then you feel sorrow for that thing, even though you may never have seen it, something like that, dead, or understood why it died, or have any other context except for the fact that it's dead, then you would have a feeling about that.
was just gonna say that then it depends on like what the, because remember it's not a uniform reaction. It depends on what the dead thing is. Like if that's a cockroach that died, right? Like your initial emotional reaction will probably be like, that's gross, you know.
Good riddance.
Yeah, good riddance. Like I'm glad it's not alive. You know, it's not around. It's not crawling around. It's not trying to fly. So like I mean, that's what I mean, right? Like I think a lot of moral determinations, like whether or not it's wrong to kill a cockroach or whether or not it's wrong for, you know, someone to hit somebody else is based on like an emotional reaction. I think
It is based on emotional reaction, and to an extent it's possibly based on a learned reaction, because we have learned in our society that those things are undesirable, and you know, we've seen them killed more often. We see them killed in animated commercials. So some of that is learned, and you can take a nature versus nurture approach to this, but that can get really complicated, because that's a big problem. But that is one of the ways to approach this is, you know, are we born a certain way? And there's very little that our environment can do to impact that. Or are we born sort of a flexible piece of Play-Doh or something that can be molded by our environment? And the answer to that may help you get closer to this. But again, that is a huge problem to tackle in a short essay.
Like I think if you go the Kantian route, you have to qualify whether or not a priori knowledge qualifies as knowledge, or whether maybe it's something else. Like I think it gets back to the idea of whether or not knowledge is just things we do, or whether or not it's something we consciously understand to be knowledge.
Right. You have to define that from the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay. What are you talking about in terms of the types of knowledge, the level of dependency? Are we talking about only personal? Are we talking about only shared? It seems like they want you to talk about shared, okay, because that's how we have knowledge as a society, and that seems to be what knowledge is. But personal knowledge is a part of TOK. So you don't have to completely ignore it, and you probably should include it. All right? To go, I guess, maybe super sappy, the knowledge that you have fallen in love with somebody. That is not, it would be hard for you to say, and definitely even more difficult to prove, that when somebody falls in love with somebody, it is because of all the other people they've met in their lives. That seems difficult to prove, and a definite, possible way around this. Yes?
Bringing it back when we were talking about global warming and this recent discovery of how these are the fossil fuels, it's these are fossil fuels in our current environment. That's why it's different than ever. But we depend on past knowledge for that, because if we didn't have past knowledge, we wouldn't know that like climate change was different back then. Do you know what I mean? Like if we didn't have the previous knowledge of climate change, we wouldn't have been able to figure out that this current issue is due to fossil fuels.
Right, and that's why this whole PT depends on your definition of what wholly is. Okay, because if you say that it is wholly dependent, then the only way we get to now is using everything in the past. But it... Interesting. That sounds like the biggest rat I've ever heard.
Wait, is that a rat?
It's Splinter.
Is her song through the room? And then somebody...
Doors locked?
I'm gonna ask you also, no, I know that was locked out.
It's just sticks.
It sounds like a drill. This right, imagine if the Kool-Aid guy just busts in.
Oh yeah! Okay. All right, so there's a perfect example. Your present knowledge, your past knowledge tells you that even though you've probably never heard a noise like that in a classroom, you're probably safe. Right? I mean, everything in your head is adding up the noises that you heard and saying, okay, doesn't seem to be too much of a problem out there. Probably, I'm aware that there's construction going on. That would explain. Now, if there was no construction going on in the building and we all heard that noise, we would probably be a little bit more concerned. But that is only saying that you're feeding stuff in, and it doesn't mean that it's entirely dependent. Thank you.
Isn't that just instincts though?
Yeah, I was gonna ask Mr. Reich.
Well, that's like
Are instincts knowledge?
nature versus nurture, or like
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
nature you know something and then by nurture you
Said that a
Would you
couple minutes
Yeah,
ago.
consider-
our instinctive
would you
reactions
consider
knowledge.
instincts as a part of
So if you want it right, if you are including intuition, then it kind of negates the whole thing, which you have to include intuition because it's one of the ways of knowing. Okay. Now, is intuition necessarily instinct? It's hard to say where the line is drawn between intuition and instinct, but it's pretty damn close. Yes, if you say I've got intuition, that intuition tends to be fed by a variety of factors, one of which might be past knowledge, but many others might be current knowledge, current awareness, current sense perception, in order to say, okay, this is something different. All right? Let's, not working. Okay. Like I said, it's a classic PT. It appears every few years. It almost seems obvious both ways, and so it's highly dependent on how you define the terms. If your definition of past knowledge is broad, all experiences, then it seems like everything is dependent on past knowledge. Okay? But again, that broad definition feels a little bit too easy to go to, right? It feels like, you're just saying, oh, okay, so anything that you've ever done contributes to everything you ever will do. And it probably contributes to the type and to the person that you are, but to say that it directly contributes to something that you're going to do in the future is a whole other thing. If your past knowledge is only defined as that shared knowledge which society has deemed to be true or useful, then it would seem you could produce much new knowledge independent of past knowledge. Okay, and this is the one that feels more like the truth. So, does the truth of this statement vary in terms of the AOKs? In math and natural sciences, there are strong traditions that almost require past knowledge. However, in the more subjective areas like arts and ethics, it seems like we could do things or know things independently and even a priori. Would you need someone to tell you that it is wrong to torture someone, or would you just feel it even if you had no reference to existing laws? And it seems like you would probably feel it. Okay? Now, ethics, you could say it's the product of all your past experiences, and so you've seen someone, in pain at some point, and you know that makes them unhappy, and so you feel that anytime you see someone in pain after that, that it should make you sad. But again, it almost feels to this like, it almost feels as if they're trying to make our knowledge into a computer program that has a definite cause and effect if-then relationship. And, that is obviously problematic because we're not robots yet. So that I think is why it feels like this is wrong. It's denying what it is that makes us human, right? It's denying this intuition, this emotion. Let's use an example that's maybe relevant to you guys right now. Deciding on which college to go to, okay? Is this a decision entirely based on past knowledge, or is it based on current circumstances as well? Right? Your entire past knowledge may have developed to the point where you feel that you should go to a certain school. But mom gets sick, Dad gets sick. Somebody in the family gets sick. Okay? Or dad loses job. All of a sudden, you are needed in the household to help support the household. So although all of your past knowledge, let's say, for example, that you wanted to become, that you have been like, I think they said Martin Scorsese, when he was like 4 years old, was like drawing up like scenes from movies with stage directions and everything like that. So let's say you were destined to become a filmmaker. Well, you obviously would want to be going out to Los Angeles. But then something happens in your family, and obviously, remember, you don't use hypotheticals, but it helps us to kind of play with the ideas. Something happens in your family, and you need to stay here to take care of them. That decision has now been informed not by past knowledge, but by present circumstances. And so, in that case, it definitely seems like we cannot say that all present knowledge is dependent on past knowledge. Okay? So that's just kind of a quick example to maybe relate to you how making decisions is based on probably a lot more than everything you've learned in your past, but also on what's happening right now.
I feel like if you wanted to argue in favor of this prompt, you could make the metaphysical argument that like literally everything that is not happening in the current moment is past knowledge. So like deciding what college you want to go to, it might seem like present or current knowledge that you have X amount of money and you're going to get X amount of financial aid and you have X interests, so that college would be a good choice to you. But you could argue that the fact that you all know that is just past knowledge that you learned in the very recent past, but because you didn't learn it like 0.01 seconds ago, it has become part of your big wealth of knowledge you have about the world that you started accumulating as soon as you could form memories at like 2 or 3, and that you add on to every second, and that every second it becomes part of your past knowledge, and that the only type of present knowledge is knowledge that just comes directly to you, maybe from like a religious revelation like what Joaquin was talking about, but everything that you learn on a daily basis is added to your wealth of knowledge that you then just look at as your past knowledge.
Listen, you're absolutely right. You could take that approach, and there would be nothing wrong with that. Okay, with any of these PTs, you could take the absolute approach, and it might even make for a more interesting PT. Okay, because it would be way more interesting to see how you could defend that. For example, the hypothetical that I just used, it would be very easy for you to say, well, wait a second, you were imbued with a sense of family responsibility throughout your life, and that is taken into account when you're making this decision. Therefore, you didn't make the decision based on current circumstances. You made it based on your current worldview, which is that as a son or daughter, it is my responsibility to take care of my family if they need it. So yes, you could make that argument, and in a lot of ways it would make it more interesting. Okay, I typically urge you to stay away from the strong support or denial, just because so much of TOK is in the middle, and because most of you don't really enjoy this a lot, and so that's the easier route to go. But if you find something that you enjoy about it, that you think is interesting, like taking an extreme position and trying to defend it throughout to the end, then by all means, that's what you should do, because it's going to make for a better essay. Okay? Yeah.
I mean, like, the thing that, like, really confused me about it is that the actual definition for knowledge is facts, information, and skills acquired by a person through experience or education, the theoretical or practical understanding of the subject. So, knowledge is actually defined as something that a person gains through past experiences and circumstances. So how can you even argue the other side if it is defined as something that you gain from past experience?
Well, it's a very good question, and the answer to that is that you should not be using straight book definitions for your definitions, okay? Because that is one definition of knowledge. What was that, Webster's or Oxford or something?
Yeah.
first of all, always use Oxford, okay? They love that crap. But if you use a straight book definition, then you are leaving out other possible interpretations of the word. And if you're just going to live by that definition, then I think that you're probably going to get penalized for not sort of thinking about it in a TOK lens, because TOK allows for what you said, which is basically the definition of shared knowledge, but it also allows for personal knowledge. Okay? So by going with only that definition, you are abandoning a personal knowledge aspect, which is fine as long as you make that clear. Okay? That you are aware that what you are doing is dealing with it as a shared knowledge issue, and that later in the essay, you then show awareness of the fact that personal knowledge does exist. And you can do that in your counter argument. Okay? So it's okay to do that as long as you say, this is what I'm doing. Okay? Good? Thank you. All right, so the last thing to sort of look at here is, are there cases in which the way knowledge is acquired, first or second hand experience, is more important than, there's a typo, whether or not there is past knowledge to back it up. Think of being told not to touch a hot stove as opposed to being burned by said stove. Okay? So the way that we acquire knowledge, burning yourself on a stove, you have acquired knowledge when you do that. That is now present knowledge. As soon as you burn your hand, now that becomes past knowledge. Right? While you're burning your hand, it's present knowledge. But after your hand has been burnt, literally a millisecond later, that has now become your past knowledge that you can use to go forward with something. Okay? So, at what point, another question is, at what point does present knowledge become past knowledge? Is it instantaneous? Or is it something that requires a process? And I think that, again, IB probably wants you to show awareness of the AOKs and that there is a process involved in developing knowledge. Okay? So a lot of this stuff is stuff that you need to do to sort of live within the TOK realm. But by far, the most important thing to do here is define the terms at the beginning, then decide on how you're going to approach them, because that shapes the entire essay. And that goes for all the essays, by the way, but it seems to be a little bit more important in this PT. Okay? All right. So that is all. Thank you for your time. And that is the last time I will ever teach you anything.